Good evening and welcome. I am Amarachi Ubani. Tonight, Nigeria and Germany sign agreements to boost trade relations between both countries as President Buhari hosts German Chancellor Angela Merkel in Abuja. President Buhari gives assurance of his administration's commitments to upholding the sanctity of the rule of law and the governance of the country. Former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank and presidential aspirant Kingsley Moghalu pulls out of pact agreement to present Fela Durotoye as a consensus presidential candidate. And fans, friends and family pay final tributes to Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, in Detroit, United States.
On business news tonight, economic analyst asks federal government to adopt development intelligence approach to improve Nigeria's manufacturing sector.
And on sports news tonight, former Super Eagles goalkeeper Vincent Enyama quits LOC Lille after 7 years at the French club.
Hello there, and from Abuja, it's end of the road for some suspected human traffickers as NAPTIP vows to intensify operations to curb the menace.
We begin with President Muhammadu Buhari's expression of displeasure with Nigerians who seek to enter Europe through illegal means, insisting that his administration does not condone the act. The president spoke at a news conference after bilateral talks with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who visited the country as part of her Africa tour. The two countries have also agreed to work together to grow businesses and create jobs for their citizens. Our State House correspondent Ibrahim Adra reports.
She is the second European leader to visit Nigeria in 1 week and the third in 2 months. Chancellor Angela Merkel's visit provides opportunity for talks on issues of common interest between Nigeria and Germany. Talks over, the two leaders addressed a news conference and particularly the vexed issue of illegal migration.
We are not, as an administration, agreeing for Nigerians to defy the desert, Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean, because they feel that there are greener pastures there, whether they are free-fed for it or not. We do not support anything illegal and indisciplined.
We will continue to impress upon people how dangerous it is for them to leave their own country through these dangerous pathways. They are putting their own lives at risk. Many of the stories they are being told about Germany or about Europe are not a true reflection of the situation on the ground.
They also hope to boost trade among the two nations through encouraging small and medium businesses, a model Germany embraces for decades. In particular, the two countries sign agreement in 3 areas that will create jobs and prosperity for citizens.
One was on sort of agricultural equipment and capacity building in the agriculture sector, with basically a German company and Nestle that will provide, the company is called Pt.1, that will provide the agricultural equipment and capacity building for our farmers. A second agreement was between Nasima and a company called African Veren, which is more on, again, capacity building and creating better relations between our two countries in terms of trade and in terms of investment. And we then signed a third agreement, which was on the automobile sector, with Volkswagen. And Volkswagen is a world leader when it comes to automobile. And that agreement will see them basically establishing operations in Nigeria.
What due diligence went into reaching these agreements, and what is in it for the country?
They have also tried to understand why things have not worked out in the past. So what we agreed with them is that first, we're going to put our two teams together, to work on developing the right, feasibilities and plans and processes that will be long-term sustainable.
In terms of investment that is expected from this visit, one gets a sense that perhaps this is another day in the sunshine for Nigeria. The totality of the investment, as enumerated, whether in energy, security or agriculture, all these could potentially grow the economy and improve the living standards of Nigerians, as envisaged by the economic growth plan of the federal government. At least this is the optimism expressed consistently by officials of government. How much impact this will make and how soon, we'll have to wait and see. Meanwhile, President Muhammadu Buhari has departed for China for yet another meeting that has business as its focus. From the presidential villa in Abuja, Ibrahim Adra, Channels Television News.
Meanwhile, the president has explained that his administration will always uphold the sanctity of the rule of law and the governance of the country. President Buhari said this during his meeting with the German Chancellor, to whom he gave the assurance that all agreements with her country would be fully respected. In a statement from the presidency, President Buhari explains that the rule of law embodies all the rightful mechanisms for a conflict resolution, both within the country and in dealing with all foreign partners. In the words of the president, unity and harmony in every society can only be preserved by observing the rule of law and ensuring that agreements reached in good faith are followed through to the mutual benefit of countries. The president's assurance is coming against the backdrop of criticism from some prominent Nigerians over his comment placing national interest above the rule of law, as even the Nobel laureate, Professor Wole Soyinka, has described as an attempt to annul the judiciary. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has ended her three-day tour of West Africa, which saw her visiting Senegal, Ghana and Nigeria. The trip aims to increase economic relations and work towards reducing the flow of migrants from the region to Europe. It also comes as the British Prime Minister Theresa May announced that she wants the UK to overtake the US to become the G7's biggest investor in Africa by 2022. In this next report, our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Temitope Fagbemi, examines the Western world's renewed interest in Africa.
The economic importance of Nigeria to Europe can never be overemphasized. That's why a few days after the British Prime Minister Theresa May visited Nigeria, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is also paying a visit to the country. Just like Mrs. May, our aim is to boost trade with Africa. So why does it seem like everyone is trying to woo the continent, where China, France, and the United States have been the dominant financial forces?
By 2022, I want the UK to be the G7's #1 investor in Africa, with Britain's private sector companies taking the lead in investing the billions that will see African economies growing by trillions. We have the tools to do so.
Meanwhile, the U.S. government says it is currently looking for African countries that will be interested in bilateral free trade agreements with it. This comes as the U.S. and China escalate their trade war with the activation of another round of dueling tariffs on $16 billion worth of each country's goods on Thursday, August 23.
I think the Trump administration is doing some lasting damage to the brand of the United States, especially with some overheated rhetoric that does, I think, no one any good. And I think that eventually what harms the United States brand in the short run could in the long run. What you do on trade policy could also be pushing friends away.
The British must find an alternative to the allies. Brexit means that they are doing away with the traditional allies, and they need to find new friends. And this is the time to come to Africa to renew, the friendship.
At the moment, it seems Africa is changing, reimagining itself and rejecting the label of the Dark Continent. The continent's leaders therefore need to decide who to prioritize: an ambitious but friendly China, the huge European Union bloc, the potential riches of the United States, or the historically linked United Kingdom. Temitope Fagbemi, reporting for Channels Television News.
Let's get some more perspective on this development regarding the renewed interest by some Western powers in Africa. Joining me on the news at 10 is former Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi. Ambassador, thank you for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you for having me here.
You have been monitoring the discussions, you've been observing, you've been making up your mind, you've been developing this discussion up until now. It's a week of diplomatic activity. We saw the British Prime Minister here 2 days ago. Today, it's the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. What do you think is behind this renewed interest in Africa?
First, I think with regards to Africa, I think, number one, they are looking at the demography of the continent. The population of this continent is growing at a very fast pace, and is beginning to look as if Africa is going to be, not going to be, it's a big, huge market in the making. Secondly is the fact that they're also interested in seeing Africa overcome its own underdevelopment so as to stem the tide of, of migration, which is what they're experiencing. And of course, the trade regime that has, governed the world all over this last couple of years is being disrupted by a number of forces, the Brexit, for example, the Trump trade wars. And you heard the British Prime Minister, saying, in fact, what she didn't say properly is that, look, we want to go back to our traditional friends, our traditional trading partners, and by 2022, Britain wants to become one of the largest G7 members to be in the continent, meaning very simply that they've realized that they've lost over the years and they want to, challenge those who are now doing business in Africa. But it's going to be, a long-drawn battle.
So how does Africa now leverage on this renewed interest? How do we make the most of it so that we're not just at the receiving end? Because there are conditions, to these seeming aid that's coming at a certain time?
There's no two ways of doing this. Africa just has to grow up. Africa has to develop and become strong in itself in order to be able to, number one, negotiate with the rest of the world, in order to have something to sell to the rest of the world. There's a lot Africa really needs to begin to do. When you make a comparison between the continent and the Asian continent, for example, and then go back to the 60s or pre-independence, we were rated high in terms of GDP than some of the countries in Asia that have become very developed. So there's no other way. You cannot negotiate from a position of weakness. You cannot be a partner, in a game in which, you are not producing much or you do not have much to sell to your, to the other countries.
But would it have been more of an advantage to us if we had all agreed to that continental free trade agreement? Would we be at a better bargaining position with the UK and the other Western powers?
To a reasonable extent or to a large extent, but the first thing is that individually we need to grow. The continent or the various countries in the region needs to develop. There are a few countries that are doing reasonably well. They are coming up well, and they are in a position to, probably define how they want to engage, some of these superpowers. I'm sure you heard, for example, the issue of the second-hand clothing between the Americans and the East Africans. And the East Africans just rejected the American offer. And he said, and because of that, a country like Rwanda was sanctioned by the United States. So when you are in a position of strength like that, you are good to begin to negotiate the terms in which you want to engage your partners.
And then you already mentioned what it would take us, what it would take for Africa to get to this position. But in the end, would the goal be achieved? You mentioned immigration, which is one of the reasons why these leaders are coming, to be able to stem migration. I remember the Spanish Prime Minister did say that leaders need to work more to develop Africa so that more people don't desire to leave. But at the end of the day, do you think that people really would take advantage of this? Would this really stem the tide? If development takes place? Some people's minds are still dead set on, getting to Europe.
No, look, there's what we call a pull factor. There's this mindset, those who want to leave this country, that there's enough job for them outside the country, and that if they go outside the country, they'll probably find things to do, or they've been convinced that Europe or the United States or China or Israel is far better. The opportunities are there for them. Therefore, if you begin to grow, if you begin to develop in this country, and they see the same level of opportunities, they're not going to travel out. The pull factor will reverse almost immediately. So as long as they still believe, and there's this pull factor that attracts people to go to these countries, they will continue to go. And I think this is why some of these leaders are, look, the German Chancellor left Germany with all sorts of, demonstrators, anti-immigrant demonstrators on the streets of Berlin, because this is becoming a big issue to them in that part of the world.
It's also a brain drain for us here. Ambassador Keshi, thank you so much for joining us. Always appreciate your thoughts and, of course, your analysis.
Thank you very much.
In part two after the break, as more aspirants declare interest to contest for president on the PDP platform, former Vice President Atiku Abubakar explains why he thinks he's the right person to pick the ticket. Please stay with us.